There is a big debate about whether sanctions against Russia are working. Some argue that they are failing to stop the Russian war machine and that Ukraine's allies need to find something else. Others say that real sanctions are yet to be applied or truly implemented. What is certain is that without the sanctions in place against Russia, Moscow would likely be occupying much more Ukrainian territory than it is. My guest today is Stephanie Baker, senior writer at Bloomberg News and author of the new book Punishing Putin: Inside the Global Economic War to Bring Down Russia. Stephanie has reported a lot from Russia, Ukraine and Eastern Europe and believes that Russia is more vulnerable than we think. You're listening to the podcast Explaining Ukraine. Explaining Ukraine is a podcast by UkraineWorld, a multilingual media about Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm a Ukrainian philosopher, chief editor of UkraineWorld and president of PAN Ukraine. UkraineWorld is a multilingual media about Ukraine brought to you by Internews Ukraine, one of Ukraine's largest media NGOs. You can support our work at patreon.com/UkraineWorld. You can also support our volunteer trips to the war zones at PayPal, Ukraine.resisting@gmail.com. You can find these links in the description of this episode. So let's start. Stephanie Baker, welcome to this podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So you're the author of a recent book which is called Punishing Putin: Inside the Global Economic War to Bring Down Russia. And this is very, very interesting and important work. And I hear two types of arguments around the question whether we can really push Putin and push Putinist Russia to end this war and to stop invading Ukraine. One of the arguments is that, okay, but we imposed so many sanctions and they didn't work, so we should try something else. And therefore, there is this talk about negotiations and everything. Another side of argument is saying, no, we haven't even started yet because we haven't even devoted so much time and so much specialists and so much efforts to really make the economic sanctions, economic maybe warfare against Putinist Russia, something very tangible. What is your stand on this?
Right. So I think the main challenge has been the lack of enforcement of the unprecedented sanctions that they rolled out since February 2022. I liken this to a grand experiment because never before has a country or an economy as big as Russia been targeted by such a large sanctions coalition. So there was a lot to learn, and I think there has been a lot learned in the past 2.5 years. I think one lesson learned is how limited the tool of sanctions can be unless countries want to incur real costs of a real economic war against Russia. And I think that's been the other limiting factor is both US, Europe, and the UK fighting inflation and not wanting to take on the risk of higher energy prices. And of course, because Russia is such a large oil exporter, that has been really the chief conundrum facing the sanctions coalition and has limited the effectiveness of the economic war. As you probably know, from being from Ukraine, the oil has always been the linchpin of the Russian economy, going back decades, even to the Soviet period. In the late 80s, the declining global price of oil undermined the health of the Soviet economy and contributed, not exclusively, but contributed to, I think, the breakup of the Soviet Union and the political changes that we saw in the 1990s. The low oil price in the 1990s hobbled Russia's ability to carry out economic reforms, coupled with, of course, extensive corruption. But I think that this has been the real challenge because Russia has this asymmetric advantage in being a hydrocarbons producer that if you really want to undermine Russia's ability to finance and sustain the war, you have to hit their oil revenues. And I think there has been a lack of willingness to do so. And the restrictions that they imposed on oil, namely the oil price cap banning Western services for oil sold above $60 a barrel, hasn't really worked. It was designed to allow Russian oil to flow because they did not want to contribute to higher oil prices. But I think that policy has been poorly enforced and could be stepped up quite dramatically. Now, having said that, while I was writing this book, I got so annoyed by everyone saying, "Oh, sanctions, they don't work. What's the point?" And I finally realized that this was actually a page straight out of Putin's propaganda playbook. That's what he wants everyone to think, because the sanctions do bother him deeply. They are creating real problems for him that he's trying to cover up. Uh, and I think they're designed to undermine that argument that sanctions aren't working. What's the point? Is really a kind of active measures playbook to undermine support for the sanctions in the West and to convince people actually they're costing the West more than they're actually costing Russia. Russia's fine. When you really look at it, Russia is facing some serious problems. Namely, it's having a mini payments crisis as a result of the sanctions, which we can talk about a bit later. But I think it's false to say that the sanctions aren't working at all. They have cost Russia hundreds of billions of dollars. Could they be working much better? Yes. Can they single handedly bring down Putin and force him to turn back and withdraw from Ukraine? No, I don't think that they can do that on their own. But uh, with this situation, the West was confronted with a nuclear power invading its neighbor. It did not want to risk a direct military confrontation with a nuclear power. And so the response shifted into the economic sphere, in addition to providing military aid to Ukraine. And the thinking when this was rolled out was that it would give the West and Ukraine more time to build up Ukraine's military capabilities by imposing sanctions and slowing Russia down. And I think the focus of the sanctions really shifted not towards, away from what many were hoping and privately, this was never explicitly the goal of sanctions, regime change, that this was probably the best way to try to bleed Russia of the resources to maintain the war. But as I said at the beginning, the big problem they have is, the hundreds of billions of dollars worth of oil exports that Russia is currently enjoying. And until they hit that, it's going to be really hard to make the economic war work.
I'm glad that you talk about oil, and this is one of your argument of your book. You're precisely talking about the reducing this price cap, if I pronounce correctly, to $30, I think. Um, but the opponents to this will say, okay, but we can no longer influence all this because there is India and China, and Russia just redirects exports. Or they say, okay, but there is a global oil production, cartels, and they will also be unhappy to have these decrease of oil prices, including even American or oil companies or European oil companies. What would you respond to this?
Well, I mean, let's face it, if they reduced the oil price cap to even 50, or ideally further 40, 30, that would force a deeper discount for Russian oil. And that would be probably welcomed by India. It would get even cheaper oil. India has entered the fray and snapped up all this Russian oil because it was able to get it at a discount. Now, since the oil price cap was introduced, Russian oil has been trading at a discount. It's not as big of a discount as some would have liked, uh, but I think that if they had um, set the oil price cap lower, or they could now even lower it, I think that could have a real impact. It would make things more difficult. And that's what the sanctions are trying to do. They're trying to create friction and problems for Putin. And I think that has worked to some extent, but I think they could massively tighten the regime. Uh, it, Obviously, the issue is that Russia is profiting off of Putin's own invasion, right? The price of oil shot up after the full scale invasion in 2022 because people were panicking about Russian supplies. And it has benefited from a relatively high price of oil over the past 2.5 years. It, it was looking like actually the price of oil was coming down right before recent tensions in the Middle East. That then shot back up again when Iran attacked Israel and there was fears of a wider war in the Middle East. It looks like that is calming down, and Iran is unlikely to retaliate. This is the sound of the response from Tehran. Uh, and perhaps if oil prices globally come down, that's bad for Putin. And that is something that would potentially enable the Western coalition to really crack down on these rusty oil tankers that Russia has been using as part of its shadow fleet, transporting oil to India and China outside of Western services. And I think they've been reluctant to really do that because they feared taking oil off the market that would then cause prices to go up. If globally prices are coming down, I think they've got more room to maneuver to really hit Russian oil revenues hard. We've seen steps towards doing that. The UK came out last week with a series of measures. It blacklisted another 18 oil tankers. In total, the Western coalition has blacklisted 90 of these tankers, but they actually haven't enforced that effectively because some of those blacklisted, those sanctioned tankers have been loading Russian oil and and delivering it with no consequences. So they need to they need to start stepping up the costs of, say, a port in India accepting Russian oil from a blacklisted tanker, whether that be the threat of secondary sanctions, sanctions on port operators or what have you. I think that could be effective. I think broadly speaking, there's this misplaced notion that you impose a sanction and then you walk away. It's like you put a band-aid on something and that's it. Whereas I I think what I tried to explain in the book was that the sanctions campaign is a dynamic process. It needs to be constantly monitored, constantly assessed, and tweaked according to conditions on the ground. Because once you introduce a sanction, you're introducing an economic distortion and immediate incentives to invade. So there has to be real attention paid to those evasion networks and how to shut them down.
Absolutely, it's a game. It's a perpetual game. You impose a sanction, and then a side on which you impose the sanction try to evade it. So you try to catch it, and it's a dynamic process, and it's a process of basically chasing somebody, right? And here comes my next question. Um, well, you will only be able, like, let's talk about the West, the collective West. You will only be able to do this policy consistently if you really think that it's not even about punishing one measure, but it's about a real economic warfare. And I think that people in the West, in Europe, and in America, and some other places, are really afraid of this language. Therefore, they do not even talk about sometimes Russia-Ukraine war. They talk about conflict. They talk about crisis, and they don't want to engage into this war fully, and therefore they don't want really to think fully. Okay, but there is a tool of measures, economic measures, because Western economies are so much bigger than the Russia's one, and they can engage more, but they should kind of change the language. And in this situation, when Russia starts the hot military war, kinetic war, at least Ukraine's partners can engage into a serious economic warfare. But for this, you need more people, especially in the implementation, as you say. How would you react to this?
I think there is a real issue with democracies rolling out these sanctions. They do need to have public support for them, and you see this playing out in the U.S. election right now. Right, there's a lot of um, concern and, frankly, support for Donald Trump because of the high cost of living and inflation that we've seen over the past few years. So that has been an ongoing issue. Now, having said that, in many ways, sanctions are a low cost tool. actually, if employed right. Um, you know, sure, there are sanctions that can be costly and cause inflation to go up in the West, but there are other sanctions that can impose real costs on the Russian economy with minimal costs at home. And I think that's a lot of, in the sense of freezing a lot of these Russian assets. That's been another big front in the economic war that I go into in the book. Um, the one most consequential action, I think, in my mind, as I go into in the book, was the decision to immobilize Russia's roughly $300 billion worth of central bank reserves.
I
Um,
will ask you about this.
yeah,
This will be my next question. Yeah, sure.
which I, it continually frustrates me and amazes me that people don't see the logic of going to the next step and seizing it and using it for Ukraine. That's a low cost option, but it's been presented and twisted as a high cost option that it potentially could have ramifications for the US dollar or the euro as reserve currencies, et cetera. So there are things that can be done that, let's just put oil aside and the risk of further inflation, which, the price of oil is influenced by a number of different factors. There are a lot of different things that can be done uh, to undermine Russia's ability to keep this war going, and perhaps force them to come to some sort of negotiated settlement on terms that are better for Ukraine. Um, but we're not there yet because they haven't really been properly enforced, and I think there are more things that can be done.
Here comes my next question, as I promised. There is a big discussion in Ukraine. There is a campaign, Make Russia Pay, done by some of my friends, Ukrainian activists. And indeed, I agree with you that, well, the major counter argument to those people in Europe or America or Japan or wherever else who are saying, okay, we don't want to pay for Ukraine's resistance, we don't want to pay for Ukraine's reconstruction because it's taxpayers' money. The most evident response is that, okay, but you have hundreds of billions of Russian money who is immobilized, who is frozen, which is frozen, and now it's probably time to use it for the benefit of Ukraine. But you see, you hear a lot of arguments against it. A lot of arguments, unfortunately, in the institutions. I hear that in the EU institutions, in particular, in American institutions. So how to fight against these arguments? How to persuade that this is the really the best option?
Yeah, I try to explain that in my book because let's face it, this is complicated stuff for a lot of people. It's hard to get your head around, and so trying to kind of simplify it and make people understand kind of where is this money, what's at stake, I think is important. And there have been people making that argument quite forcefully. And I go into some of those characters in my book. Larry Summers, the former Treasury Secretary, is one of them, who had been talking with the Biden administration for quite a while, trying to persuade them to back that. And of course, the Biden administration now does support that. So does the UK and Canada. And the big problem has been Europe. And as I detail in the book, if you look at what Russia did with its reserves in the run up to the invasion, it looked like they were making a calculated bet. They were reducing their dollar holdings, increasing their euro holdings, I think in anticipation of the sanctions, because in 2014 there had been threats, not very serious ones, about freezing Russia's central bank reserves, and it never happened. But it does look like Putin, uh, it was part of his strategy of building so-called Fortress Russia. He was betting that if he shifted a bigger portion of Russia's reserves into euros, they'd be too divided to act. And indeed, he was right. They were united enough to immobilize them, but to go to the next step and seize them, that has been incredibly divisive within Europe. You've had figures such as Viktor Orban of Hungary opposed, but even big European powers like Germany and France have been reluctant because of fears that this could undermine the strength of the euro. And I think the best way to argue for this to happen is to highlight the some of the legal precedents that have happened. It happened with the Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in 1990. They did end up sequestering Iraqi oil revenues to pay compensation for that war. That was a UN mandated process. Now, the problem is the UN is having a bit of an existential crisis at the moment, in part because Russia and China's vetoes in the Security Council. Um, and so new structures need to be created to do this. And um, I think it's inevitable that the money will be used for Ukraine, but it may be too late, and that is what is the tragedy unfolding right now. And it's similar to what's happening with military aid to Ukraine. It's sort of we're always two steps behind where we need to be. And I do explain in the book and interview some figures that have been advocating very strongly on Ukraine's behalf that Ukraine needs this money now in order to be able to win the war. It's not they can't wait until um, there's some kind of hoped for, maybe never materializing political change in Russia for Russia to agree to pay war reparations. That may never happen. Um, so I think it depends on political will, particularly in Europe. And you see very forceful advocates. I mean, I know Ursula von der Leyen has been supportive of this, but there has not been enough support within Europe, and certain opposition, in particular. Lagarde, the ECB chief, the ECB president, president of the European Central Bank, Christine Lagarde, has been very skeptical of that proposal. So that what they ended up doing was creating this sort of financial engineering solution to raise a $50 billion loan for Ukraine, backed by the interest payments on that pot of money because they were earning a lot of money. And so that's a short term fix. And it's good that they did that. Biden's deputy national security advisor for international economics, a man called Dalip Singh, someone I go into and interview in the book, he was the one who kind of came up with that formulation and really pushed it forward. And it's finally been passed. It took even that took so much wrangling to get over the line. Um, but I do think we still need to keep arguing that this this pot of money really belongs to Ukraine. That um, Russia's never getting that money back until they pay war reparations. So, what is the point of Western taxpayers paying for Ukraine's military defense and reconstruction if there's all this Russian money sitting in the West?
Let me ask, the next question will be also kind of global. And the question is, where is Russia vulnerable? But let me ask you from your personal perspective, because as far as I understand, this book was born out of your reporting about Russia. And maybe you can tell a little bit about the background, how probably your vision of Russia evolved and developed with time. And as you know, the situation in Russia, much better than many just other people in the West who are dealing with other issues. What is your take on this? Where is those point of vulnerability of Russia that people in the West probably don't recognize?
Yeah, so I got my start as a reporter. I first worked for several years in Eastern Europe and then worked for a couple years in Moscow, but traveling around Russia during the chaotic 1990s. And that was when I fell into being an economics business reporter, because the big story at the time was this just massive transfer of wealth that was happening through privatization. And I had a first row seat to the rise of the sort of first wave of oligarchs who got rich during that period. In the run up to the 1998 ruble crisis, I also did go to Ukraine during that period. So my first trip to Ukraine was in like 1998. So I've always seen both sides of this. Obviously, what we witnessed, the chaos and the economic pain of the 1990s, I believe, did give rise to a figure like Putin. I think that the Russians were hungry and eager for stability and financial stability, and I think you see that is what Putin did. He basically did a pact with the Russian people and the Russian oligarchs. I will give you stability and steadily rising standards of living in exchange for fewer political freedoms. And of course, that has gotten much worse over the past 24 years that Putin has been in power. And he's continued to narrow those political freedoms to the point where we're now at full on totalitarian state, where reporters like me can't even go to Russia. This is worse than the Soviet Union, when there were Western reporters allowed to work, albeit with restrictions. But I didn't, for instance, did not feel safe enough to go to Russia to do this book. I hired a freelance Russian reporter to be my eyes and ears on the ground. But that's a real reflection of where we've come to now. I had done several interviews with some of the big billionaires, Russian billionaires, who were the target of these sanctions. So I had a lot of years of reporting I could lean back on to sort of chart the change over that period of time. But Russia has evolved into a mafia state. And I think that's the other main challenge of the sanctions, is how do you deal with a mafia state? Because they have rolled out sanctions on a lot of these Russian oligarchs, but they're all tied in with Putin. If he goes down, they likely go down with him. That is kind of the nature of a mafia. Even the first wave oligarchs who didn't necessarily get rich off of Putin's rule, they hold their assets with his blessing, and live in fear of having their assets taken, or perhaps falling out of a window somewhere. So how do you go after a mafia state like that? Well, I think it is undermining the health of the Russian economy as a whole. And unfortunately, that takes time to build up pressure. And Ukraine doesn't have a lot of time. So I think the slow rollout of the sanctions has been part of the problem. If they'd done some of these things early on, we might be in a different place. Uh, I think hitting the Russia-China partnership is one particular vulnerability, because I think Russia is very dependent on China at this point. And I think for China, the trade with Russia is tiny compared to China's trade with the world. So in December, for instance, the Biden administration threatened to impose sanctions on foreign financial institutions that do business with Russia's military-industrial complex, and then they widened that threat in June, and I think that did have an impact. And you saw Chinese banks stepping away. You saw that causing this problem, these payment problems in Russia. Chinese yuan became scarcer. The cost of borrowing in Chinese yuan shot up. But just imagine if they had made that threat in 2022, that maybe that would have curtailed some of the Chinese exports of semiconductors that Russia needs for its precision-guided weaponry, for instance. So I think the slowness of it is unfortunate, but I do think that you do see pressure starting to build. It's unclear how long Putin can sustain this war at the rate he's going. I mean, just look at the fact that he's turned to North Korea, not only for missiles and artillery, but he's now got North Korean troops. That's a sign of the intense labor shortage that Russia is experiencing right now, in part because of um, the sanctions and his efforts to put the economy on a war footing. But it's also, a sign of uh, Russia perhaps not having as easy access to the Western technologies as it did in the first 2 years of the war, because of the threats from the U.S. So I think if the U.S. can really try to drive a wedge between Russia and China, that might help. Again, try to drive a wedge between India and Russia, that would help as well. You see both, I think India in particular is sort of playing this double game. They're trying to hedge their bets as to, the outcome of this war. They want to keep cheap Russian oil flowing, but they don't want to cut off their ties to the West. So I think if India can be brought more on board, I think that would help a lot.
You touched upon the topic of oligarchs, and I think this is a very important one. And you write a lot in your book about how Russian oligarchs are actually using the loopholes of the Western economy, and how they set up in Western capitals such as London or Paris. And attacking the wealth of these oligarchs is obviously a very important part of the game, but you also refer to one of the arguments, and I think it's a very important argument, is that okay, but oligarchs don't really play a role in Russia because really their property depends directly on Putin, and if Putin decides to just to take them their property away, as he did many times with other people, then he will do it. So in Russia, you don't have a really property rights. Do you still think that well, pressing the oligarchs, pressing the rich people in Russia is a way to introduce possible changes?
Well, it hasn't worked so far. Um, and you haven't seen any major figures turn on Putin. There's one I go into in my book, an entrepreneur called Oleg Tinkov, who's been kind of compared to the Richard Branson of Russia. He started a bank, and he came out very strongly against Putin on Instagram, on his social media channels. Saying the war was crazy, the country was, morally bankrupt, the like. He was sanctioned in the UK, and it took more than a year for him to get off that sanctions list. And I think that they missed an opportunity to try to really signal to some of Russia's billionaires that if they came out very strongly against Putin and the war, some of them made sort of lukewarm criticisms, war is bad, but they never really attacked Putin as the one who launched the invasion. I think there was a missed opportunity that they could have used the sanctions to really divide the elite around Putin. Now, of course, that creates this whole other conundrum, right? Because a lot of these guys are really corrupt, and do you really want them to continue with their positions of power? The way this could have played out is they could have gotten a lot of these guys to come out against the war. Their assets in Russia would have been seized. Maybe they would have been able to get their assets in the West unfrozen. Um, I think there was a proposal by the UK government, for instance, that frozen Russian assets of individuals could be donated to Ukraine, but there was no sanctions relief tied to it. So it was sort of like, well, why would any of these guys do that? They might get their assets in Russia taken. They might fall out of a window or get poisoned. And as if there was no sanctions relief, what was the point of doing that? I mean, it's a really tough one, and I would love to. I'm not sure how the Ukrainians view that because some people I spoke to said, "Well, look, Putin exists because of the oligarchy, and you have to destroy the oligarchy if you're going to destroy Putin's regime." To some degree, I agree with that, but there was no real alternative offered um, to them to try to, undermine the Putin regime. And a lot of them have since gone back to Russia and are participating in the war economy, right? At this point, it's really hard to operate a major business in Russia without being either directly or indirectly involved in Putin's war machine. So, was there an opportunity for them to be offered some kind of deal? Come out against the war, renounce your Russian citizenship, donate X% to Ukraine, and you can live a peaceful life in the West. I'm not sure any of them actually would have taken that deal because they are part of this mafia state. So I don't think they would have felt um, either able or willing. And I think a lot of them were too focused on the assets they'd built up, and they didn't want to give that up. I think it came down to greed ultimately.
And they are afraid, of course, of being, as you say, poisoned, even when they're outside. Let me ask a different question because it's also a point that you raise in the book. Because there are people who criticize sanctions against Russia, and obviously we can see that they were not able so far to stop the war. But can we imagine a different scenario when sanctions are not applied at all? What would have happened? Can we imagine? Can we build this imaginary situation? What would have happened in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, imagine if we hadn't done any of this and we'd allowed Russia to have its full access to its entire, war chest of central bank reserves to stabilize the ruble. Well, the ruble would probably be much more stable, and it's now it would not be facing the kind of macroeconomic challenges that it is now. Um, Western companies would probably still be operating in Russia and paying taxes to the Russian government. Uh, and Russia would have had free, unfettered access to Western technology. Now, some of those sanctions, were very leaky, and a lot of stuff got through. But there is evidence that Russia had to pay more in order to get its access to semiconductors that it needed for missiles and the like. So, if it hadn't had any of those restrictions imposed, I think it would be an even stronger position. um, its defense industry would be much stronger. It would be able to produce probably more missiles more quickly, um, and it would be able to pay soldiers even bigger bonuses than they're paying now. I think it's hard to imagine a world where Russia invades Ukraine and there is no economic response. We continue to do business as usual with Russia despite all that's happening on the ground in Ukraine. I think that's a hard picture to imagine. I do think it has made it harder for Russia. Unfortunately, it hasn't made it hard enough, and it's one of the arguments I'm trying to make, and it's I continually making it on various sort of media appearances that this is the least we can do is you know turn a chapter on business as usual with Russia, this kind of 3 decades of economic integration with the West, that enough is enough. Why should Russia be able to use the US dollar? Why should a state like Russia, which is violating this rules based order and violating the UN Charter, why do they get to use the currency of the country I was born in? That which is based on a rules based order, where there is law and order. And that's part of the reason why the US dollar is a reserve currency. So I do think it's important to highlight, what this might have looked like if we hadn't done this. And I know people are critical that the sanctions haven't worked, but I don't think carrying on as if this hadn't happened, like we did in 2014, was really a viable option.
Yes, absolutely. And I do think that sanctions undermined Russia significantly. And therefore, currently, it is making progress in Donbass, which is very tragic and which is very, very painful. Uh, they have been succeeding in taking villages and towns, but they're not doing that in Kiev or in Lviv. Let me ask maybe the last question, if but it's kind of also a fantasy question, imagination question. If you're invited to talk to G7 leaders about what else G7, who are partners of Ukraine, what else they can do about Russia, what would you advise to?
I would, the first thing on my list would be Russian oil revenues. Really go after the shadow fleet, because it's not just about undermining Putin's ability to finance the war. These tankers are a threat to the environment in the West. They are an accident waiting to happen. And I'm shocked that the West has allowed this trade to continue going on, not only because of the revenues that Russia is earning from it, but because of the possibility of an oil spill off the coast of, say, Denmark or the UK, which I think is real. Um, I think that putting pressure on some of these US semiconductor companies that have allowed their components to flow via China and Hong Kong and India to Russia, I think that would be my number two um, fairy tale wish list. That if they actually told them, you need to start operating like banks. Remember 20, 25 years ago, banks were forced to really up their compliance programs to root out money laundering and terrorist financing. And now banks are really the mechanism through which a lot of these sanctions are enforced. Well, I think it's high time that some of these semiconductor companies really invest in vetting their supply chains to make sure that Russia is really cut off from the components it needs to make these precision guided weaponry. Um, and I think that there's more that can be done. Look, there's the other area that the West has not targeted, and it's only recently come up. Some metals, titanium, where Russia is an outsized player in the market, palladium, and there has now been talk about potentially imposing sanctions on those two metals. I think that could further degrade and undermine Putin's budget revenues. So there is more that can be done, but of course it will mean costs for Western economies. And I think we just need to accept that we're in a new era. The 3 decades of globalization that we had and the so-called peace dividend from the end of the Cold War, that's over now. That we're going to have to deal with higher costs. We're in a new world with new challenges, and unless we want to face further global security threats down the road, we should be, doing everything we can to undermine Russia's ability to invade its neighbors.
Stephanie Baker, thank you so much for joining this podcast.
Thanks for having me.
This was a podcast explaining Ukraine by UkraineWorld, a multilingual website about Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm a Ukrainian philosopher, chief editor of UkraineWorld, and president of PEN Ukraine. My guest today was Stephanie Baker, senior writer at Bloomberg News and author of the recent book Punishing Putin: Inside the Global Economic War to Bring Down Russia. Let me remind you that you can support our work at patreon.com/UkraineWorld. You can also support our volunteer trips to the war zones at PayPal, Ukraine.resisting@gmail.com. You can find these links in the description of this episode. Stay with us and stand with Ukraine.